of Nature and Natural Climate Solutions draft policy for public engagement. So just to run through what the policy is about and the basis behind it. As we all know that the climate crisis is a threat multiplier, and nowhere is this clearer than in the loss of biodiversity. There is a direct proportionality relationship between increased warming and species extinction. The IPCC, in its sixth cycle of reporting, noted that a 3-degree increase in planetary warming will lead to 41% of mammals losing their habitat. Now we know that Southern Africa is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase, meaning that as the world overshoots by 1.5 degrees, our region will overshoot by 3 degrees. Now this is going to be a disaster for biodiversity in biodiversity loss in South Africa. So hence the urgent need for this policy. Now the policy aims to advance the following goals. The first being, of course, to advance an awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet. This is the third goal of the Climate Justice Charter. This policy advances an ecosystems awareness which situates humans in nature. Its goal is to advance holistic, complex systems thinking, which respects the wholeness of life forms, as well as the inter and intra-relationships between humans and non-human life. The second goal, of course, is to inspire a break with anti-human, as well as human-centered approaches to biodiversity. The third goal is to drive an earth-centered approach to biodiversity and conservation. This approach rejects the logic of corporate environmentalism, which posits non-human life as mere natural capital to be exploited. Instead, this policy is about defending the natural commons. And by natural commons, I'm referring to land, water, biodiversity, creative human labor, and the earth systems. All of these are central to the deep just transition to bring down emissions and to ensure ecosystem adaptation capacities. As we all know, our oceans are carbon sinks, as well as releasing 50% of our oxygen. The fourth goal of this policy, of course, is to underline the emergency or the urgency of the climate crisis, as well as the tipping points and the feedback loops that it has engendered, some of which are now irreversible within the century. The fifth goal is to reimagine conservation, restoration, and management of non-human life forms, but also to reclaim nature-based solutions. And the ultimate goal of this policy is to preserve life, and also it is to strengthen the constitutional democracy of South Africa by advancing a community-centered approach to conservation through biodiversity and the natural commons. Now, South Africa is among South Africa is among the most biodiverse countries in the world. We have about 95,000 known species. We are home to about 10% of the world's plant species, 15% of the world's marine species, and about 7% of the world's mammals, reptiles, and bird species. So it boasts some of the highest rates of endemism in the world. However, this rich biodiversity is seriously threatened, and the climate crisis as a threat multiplier is only making things worse. So we have seen in our country that environmental protection measures are not being followed, and the perpetrators of ecocide, the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life, they are not being held accountable. There's poor coordination between the government departments and agencies on biodiversity conservation. Now, this state of affairs is being worsened by the climate crisis, which is compounding all of these factors. But central to this document is an understanding that there is hope. Although we are seeing the loss of species, some of which, of course, is irreversible. Although we are seeing extinction rates going up exponentially, but there is hope because habitats can be regenerated, ecosystems can be restored, and the web of life can flourish. What we are seeing is that the Earth systems have an incredible ability to transform, to evolve, and to regenerate. However, time is of the essence. And if urgent action is not taken, then the rate of species extinction will continue to accelerate. So solving the crisis of biodiversity loss requires a transformative and decolonial way of thinking, which requires reconnecting with an earth-centered approach to biodiversity loss. Now, all of this is well argued in the strategic perspectives of the cjcm that I spoke about earlier on. Now, the Ecocide project in South Africa started with the domination of nature, women, and the racial other under colonialism. And it has continued with environmental apartheid, the legacy of which still persists today. Colonialism, of course, exploited the environment for the benefit of the colonial empire and the capitalists. Wildlife was decimated by trophy hunting, by ivory exports, and by culling. Colonial acts such as the National Parks Acts of 1926 prohibited non-white people from accessing the environment, while large swaths of land were overgrazed and destroyed through mechanistic tillage, which releases tons of carbon from the soil. So colonialism introduced the separation between humans and nature, and it undermined many of the emancipatory ecologies and indigenous worldviews that existed in Africa. Now we saw this with the Khoi and the San, the first environmentally conscious people in South Africa who fought for generations to resist the enclosure of the commons. Of course, they were fighting against these colonial attempts to recreate home, to make South Africa look like Europe by introducing exotic foreign species. As it stands today, the impact of alien invasive species on South Africa's water runoff is estimated at about 1.4 to 2.4 billion cubic meters per year. Now, the apartheid regime continued the exploitation through ecocide by entrenching environmental racism and cramming Black people into tiny Bantustans. Now, the regime had very loose regulations over white farmers and their use of water and chemicals like insecticides, pesticides, and fertilizers, which over the years, of course, have been destroying water streams, causing eutrophication, and of course, insect loss. Insect loss is a serious problem that has not been given serious attention because it will result in a loss of pollinators, which will be catastrophic for the global food systems. Now, the post-apartheid democratic government has only continued this ecocide project. South Africa's biodiversity is deteriorating exponentially. And South Africa being one of the most biodiverse countries in the world with such high rates of endemism, we have 1,500 endemic vascular plants, which are found nowhere else in the world. And secondly, more than 70% of our natural areas have been cleared, have been destroyed. So we are destroying endemic plants which are not found anywhere else in the world. Now, the 2018 biodiversity assessment made the following findings. It found that out of 1,021 ecosystems that were assessed, half of them are classified as threatened. Sorry. found the highest proportion of critically endangered ecosystems is in rivers and wetlands. 42% of river ecosystems are critically endangered, while 61% of wetland systems are critically endangered. Now, damming, unsustainable water use, the climate crisis, and heavy metal spillage like acid mine drainage are the leading causes, coupled with the growing rate of sewage going into freshwater systems, due, of course, to the failure of the government. There is increased extinction rate in all taxonomical groups, meaning rates at all levels. Whether you are looking at a kingdom or a class or order or a family or a genus, there is simply increased extinction rates in all taxonomical groups. 70% of fish stocks have been fully exploited. 99% of ecosystems and estuaries are threatened with extinction, while in wetlands, it's 8% of species. Now, this is consistent with a biodiversity loss around at a global level. For example, if you look at amphibians, the International Convention of Nature has made these following estimates of threatened species with lower and upper estimates. For example, if you look at amphibians, the lowest estimate would be at 35% of amphibians being threatened with extinction, while the higher estimate will be 50% of amphibians. So the 41% they put there is more or less the average. Sharks, rays, 37%, mammals 21%, reptiles also. So that's one of the things the policy outlines: the biodiversity loss in South Africa and the biodiversity loss in the world. And then the policy also looks at the policy limits and challenges within South Africa. It addresses first and foremost problems with Section 24 and the fact that Section 24 advances a human-centered approach to protecting nature. Nature is protected for the enjoyment of present and future generations of humankind. Nature is not protected for its intrinsic value. So hence it's called anthropocentric. And then the policy deals with the consequences of a failure to have a specialized environmental court. Now, South Africa does not provide, our constitution that is, does not provide for the establishment of a specialized environmental court, nor has any act of parliament provided for the permanent establishment of a specialized court. There have been instances where a specialized environmental court was set up, for example, in the Western Cape in 2003, as well as in the Eastern Cape in 2007, when they set up a specialized court just for abalone, to combat abalone poaching. But of course, it was only dealing specifically with abalone poaching and no other environmental issues. And these are courts that had a very limited time span. So the consequences of not having a specialized environmental court is that there's always delayed adjudication. As we all know that our courts are overburdened. Nominees for the position of Chief Justice made this very clear when they appeared before the JCC. It is also well known that there's a delay in criminal cases, in all types of cases, be it environmental or criminal. And the other consequence of not having a specialized environmental court is that it makes ease of justice difficult to access. And the result is a lot of environmental cases, even though they are supposed to be cases about Section 24, but you find that they are cases about procedures. Once the state has followed the procedure, for example, to grant an environmental license, it then becomes difficult to challenge that on the basis of Section 24. Well, this comes from something called constitutional subsidiary, which means that where legislation is enacted to give effect to a constitutional right, a litigant may not bypass that legislation and rely directly on the Constitution without challenging the legislation as falling short of the constitutional standard. So you find a lot of environmental cases are merely cases of procedure, and they are not cases about protecting the environmental rights of peoples and communities. The policy also talks about the dangers of allowing mining regulation to be placed under a different department, the Department of Mineral Resources, rather than the Department of the Environment, because this has created a fractious regulatory system whereby we now see that we have 6,000 abandoned mines. 2,000 of them are a critical danger to communities. So there's been a failure to adequately enforce environmental regulation with regard to mining. Well, because of the historical privilege relationship that mining has enjoyed over the years, and the fact that the regulation of mining continues to be fragmented between two departments which do not have adequate departmental coordination. So there are several laws, of course, which have been enacted to give effect to Section 24 of the Constitution, such as the National Environmental Management Act, NEMA, which is the overarching law. But the problem is NEMA, for example, does not prohibit trophy hunting. Trophy hunting under NEMA is legal, provided that licensing procedures have been met. NEMA, of course, has failed to prevent the overexploitation of marine life through industrial fishing. NEMA does not ban culling, and of course, like Section 24 itself, NEMA is based on human-centered set of regulations which do not respect the intrinsic value of non-human life. But the positive thing about NEMA is that NEMA has provided a broad legal standing for people to approach a court, and it has also enshrined the right of communities to say no. The problem is that many communities do not understand their rights because, as we know, South Africa is not a constitutionally conscious society. So another law, of course, is the Marine Living Resources Act of 1998. The 2014 amendment was meant to change regulations for small-scale fishers. But of course, the Marine Living Resources Act has criminalized a lot of small-scale fishing. It's been a disaster for small-scale fishers. Meanwhile, it has not prevented industrial fishing from destroying and over-exploiting our water systems. Now, in some areas, regrettably, small-scale fishers are being forced into illegal fishing because they cannot obtain a fishing license. Because NEMA, the Marine Living Resources Act has made it very difficult for small-scale fishers to have fishing licenses. Meanwhile, it has been expanding the total allowable catch for large-scale industrial fishing. So in other words, people are now being turned into criminals in order to sustain their livelihoods. In 2020, South Africa exported around 10 billion rand worth of seafood, the top destination, of course, being Europe. So the Marine Living Resources Act has been centered on an export-led fishing network, which does not support small-scale fishers. The Biodiversity Act of 2004 is also another law enacted to give effect to Section 24. Now, the problem with this particular act is that it legalizes bioprospecting, which we call biopiracy, the capture of indigenous knowledge of plants for the purpose of commercial use. Now, along with the Genetically Modified Organisms Act of 1997, this particular act permits the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment, and it grants extraordinary discretionary powers to the Minister of the Environment on the regulation of genetically modified species, which is the next enclosure of the commons. The next act is the Integrated Coastal Management Act, which its purpose, of course, is to prohibit pollution at sea, also to prohibit incineration next to the ocean. But the act has failed to prevent pollution. South Africa disposes about 250,000 tons of waste into the ocean annually. Plastic, of course, makes up the bulk of this. In 2008, about 107,000 tons of plastic was disposed into the sea. Now, a lot of this plastic comes from the failure of municipalities to adequately deal with issues of waste management. So this is the waste that ends up on our ocean. Now we know that the SA coastline is due to its geographic location has a very high shipping volume, and we see cargo ships that contribute to pollution through black carbon, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. The National Water Act also it has failed to protect wetlands and has not addressed the colonial legacy of private dams. One of the reasons why our water systems are fragmented. The National Forest Act of 1998, it has not been updated, of course, to meet the scale of biodiversity. I mean, in just 20 years between 2001 and 2020, South Africa lost about 26% of its tree cover. So these are just some of the acts, but of course the list is not exhaustive, but just to give you a picture of the failures in the policy implementation. So the CJC approach to rights of nature and natural climate solutions. Like I said at the beginning, that one of the things this policy aims to do is to reclaim nature-based solutions. Now, CJC approach to the rights of nature is based on a plurivision. Now, plurivision means addressing the legacies of the past, dealing with the crisis of today, and building a livable future for human and non-human life. CJC Rights of Nature is about reclaiming African emancipatory ecologies, indigenous philosophies. It's also about reclaiming indigenous knowledge, which has been discarded, of course. The CJC Rights of Nature is about rejecting corporate-led environmentalism, reclaiming natural climate solutions. Now we know that large corporations have been promoting carbon markets, carbon capture and storage. All of these are false solutions and are based on ideas of, geoengineering and techno approaches to the climate crisis. Now, this policy argues that natural climate solutions cannot be used as a substitute for urgently cutting down greenhouse gas emissions and rapidly phasing out fossil fuels. Also, natural climate solutions cannot be a cover-up for the capitalist enclosure of indigenous commons, nor can they misappropriate millennia of indigenous knowledge and practices. Now, 80% of global biodiversity is in indigenous lands. That must be noted in natural climate solutions. And these are lands that store 20% of carbon sequestered by tropical and subtropical forests. Now, immediate measures for the state to advance at a policy level to stop biodiversity loss must be taken. An immediate ban on trophy hunting, a ban on ivory and rhino horn trading with serious legal penalties like lifelong sentences imposed for offenders, wild meat trading to be properly regulated through existing laws to ensure that it protects the rights of animals and benefits local consumption. Urgent action must be taken to fix wastewater plants, to prevent raw sewage spilling into our oceans. Regulation on chemical plants near freshwater systems must be stopped or tightened and should be prohibited. Urgent estuary and wetland recovery plan must be developed. An abandoned mine rehabilitation plan and tailing dam strategy must be urgently developed as well to protect communities, regenerate ecosystems, and to protect water systems. Now, the management of biodiversity needs to transcend political borders to bioregionalism. For example, the demarcation of provinces or the demarcation of municipalities does not take nature into account. However, we know that with rising heat waves, with rising climate shocks, animals are going to need bio corridors in order to navigate these different climate extremes. So the management of biodiversity must transcend municipalities, must transcend provinces. Now, in a lot of provincial governments, there has not been a biodiversity strategy for that particular province. And hence, there's been a lack of enforcement procedures and mechanisms and stuff like that. Also, with regards to tree planting, because tree planting has been largely promoted as a trendy approach to the climate crisis. But we looked at tree planting through mixed species. We looked at tree planting through indigenous species. We also looked at restoration through the potentialities that lie in rewilding, because nature has an incredible ability to transform and regenerate itself when left to its own potentials. And we also advance decolonial convivial conservation, which deals with the socio-economic roots of biodiversity crisis, biodiversity loss and crisis, which of course are causing the sixth mass extinction that we are living in now. So there are some policy implications as I wrap up. A national register of indigenous sacred places and rock arts supported by documentation centers must be established. Further research must be done at universities on indigenous emancipatory ecologies. Our current national parks expanded through connected biocorridors to enable animals to be able to mitigate some of these increasing things like heat waves and stuff like that. Industrial scale fishing must be banned in South Africa. Promotion of biodiversity registers and protocols for our ocean commons, protection of our biomes, wetlands and forest and riverine systems, protected through people's biodiversity registers and protocols. Now, this is important also in ensuring that we have a people-centered and community-based approach to biodiversity instead of the exclusionary approach to biodiversity that we have seen over the years. Transition towns and eco-social housing must be developed to promote natural commons through parks, agroecology gardening systems, eco-walks, the protection of endemic wild species, and ecocide law must also be promoted and enacted for South Africa. An environmental court must be established. Environmentalism must be prohibited. Extractivism must be prohibited in communal land in South Africa, and people's rights to consent must be respected. So that's one of the things we talk about, people's biodiversity protocols as part of ensuring that we have a community-centered and people-based approach to biodiversity. Now, one of the things we also note in these policies that with all these different approaches, it is clear that something has to be done. However, there are also reactionary forces which seek to maintain the status quo. These reactionary forces are fascist in nature. They promote a lifeboat approach where they save their countries and their people while the rest of the world perishes. So it is thus essential that South Africa's attempt to protect biodiversity must stand resolute and firm, and that the climate and environmental justice is social justice. So I apologize for going over the time, but thank you very much. Bish, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. That was very, very important, and it gives insight into some of the sort of deeper thinking that's gone into the policies we have, the legislation we have, the gaps that exist, and where we want to take it in a transformative direction to ensure we accelerate the deep just transition. I mean, the point to take away, comrades, is that elephants, rhinos, animals, etc., they regenerate ecosystems. And the more we create spaces for them to thrive, the more biodiversity thrives. So that's very, very important. Biodiversity trees, shrubs, plants, our ocean ecosystems absorbs carbon. So we have to keep these things resilient. We have to keep them dynamic as part of affirming the commons and commons management approaches to this. So that's crucial in what Charles has shared. Now, we